Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nikki Newman had spent decades entangled in Victor's shadow, tethered to a man whose brilliance and cruelty were woven into the very fabric of Genoa City's power structure. And though she had left him, loved him, returned to him, and hated him in equal measure across the years, she now stood in a chilling place she had never expected to find herself. The precipice of betrayal, staring at an alliance so unholy that even her fractured conscience recoiled at its weight. Yet the desperation, the decades of scars, and the newest realization of what Victor had truly done behind closed doors pushed her forward into the orbit of two men she had never thought she would conspire with, Jack Abbott, her former lover and sworn enemy of Victor, and Kane Ashby, the unlikely strategist whose ruthlessness had grown far darker since his return from self-exile under the Aristotle Demar identity. And so it began, not as a whim, not as a whispered temptation, but as a calculated decision born of necessity. When Nikki found herself in Victor's office one late night, his voice rasping with authority as he shredded documents that revealed an international fraud so colossal it risked destroying everything she held dear, including her children, her grandchildren, and even her own freedom if the authorities ever discovered how deeply she had been unknowingly complicit in laundering Newman Enterprises' money, she realized, with a sting like venom, that Victor would sacrifice her without hesitation, as he had sacrificed others, because to him, power was not simply oxygen, it was his god, his absolution, his narcotic, and in that moment Nikki understood that survival meant severing ties in the most permanent way possible. But she could not do it alone. Not against Victor's empire, not against his legendary cunning, and thus she reached out to Jack, knowing the Abbott patriarch's hatred of Victor burned eternal. A flame rekindled each time Victor stole Jabot, manipulated Phyllis, or humiliated Jack before the entire business world. Jack listened to her proposal in the quiet of the Abbott Mansion library, his hand tightening around a glass of bourbon, his blue eyes narrowing not with shock but with something colder, calculation, because deep down, despite the decades of rivalry, he had once cared for Nikki, and perhaps still did, and while the thought of crossing a line into bloodshed had always felt like an abyss too far, the lure of a Victor-free world, of finally toppling the man who had ruined his family countless times, seduced him into silence before he finally asked, "What exactly are you asking of me, Nikki?" And her reply, trembling yet resolute, "To help me end him, permanently," transformed the atmosphere in the room into something that reeked of sulfur, betrayal, and destiny. But even with Jack's resources, with his knowledge of Victor's business dealings, they needed someone who could execute, who could weave the tactical into the emotional, someone willing to risk everything for a reward, and that someone came in the form of Kane Ashby, the disgraced but shrewd manipulator who had nothing left to lose, or at least nothing Victor had not already destroyed by aligning Kane's enemies against him. Kane, after faking his death, hiding under assumed identities, clawing his way back into Genoa City with an audacity that impressed even his detractors, understood the mechanics of power better than most, and when Nikki and Jack approached him, he did not flinch, did not recoil. He smiled, a tight, knowing smile, and said, "So the Queen and the Knight finally come to the rogue. What's the price for the King's head?" And here, the true heart of the alliance revealed itself. For Nikki was not asking for revenge alone, she was offering something in return, her influence, her ability to hand Kane a legitimate path into the upper echelon of Genoa City's financial aristocracy by ensuring that when Victor was gone, Newman Enterprises would be fractured and ripe for takeover. With Kane positioned as an inside partner through Nikki's shares, Jack's corporate maneuvering, and Kane's ruthless execution. But for Jack, the trade was simpler. Victor's elimination was its own reward, though beneath that ran the possibility of Jabot finally rising unchallenged, free from Newman interference, free from Victor's sabotages. And for Nikki, the cost was her soul, the betrayal of vows and decades, the silent acceptance that she was orchestrating her husband's assassination in exchange for survival, freedom from his stranglehold, and perhaps, if she allowed herself the fantasy, peace. Yet nothing in Genoa City ever unraveled cleanly. And as they began their clandestine meetings in Kane's dimly lit safe house, poring over blueprints of the Newman ranch, discussing Victor's security protocols, debating whether it would be poison, a staged accident, or something more brutal, the three conspirators were forced to confront not Only the mechanics of murder but the unspoken truths binding them. Nikki's guilt and rage, Jack's insatiable hunger to defeat Victor, and Kane's thirst for legitimacy and vengeance against the empire that had humiliated him. Each night, their plans grew more detailed. Kane, leveraging his old contacts, acquired access codes to Victor's private jet hangar. Jack secured insider information about Newman board meetings where Victor would be most vulnerable, and Nikki herself, trembling with equal parts fear and resolve, volunteered to distract Victor long enough for Kane to strike. The tension among them simmered with the intimacy of shared damnation, and sometimes Jack would look at Nikki with something like sorrow, whispering, "You'll never come back from this." While Kane would scoff, "She doesn't want to come back, Jack, she wants to be free." And still, beneath every whispered strategy lay the haunting question, what would become of them after Victor's blood was spilled? For though Kane dreamed of controlling a fractured Newman empire and Jack dreamed of finally breathing without Victor's shadow, Nikki knew that freedom would taste of ash. And yet she pressed on, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victor tearing apart her family piece by piece, and she could no longer live as the collateral damage to his empire. The night of execution drew closer, and Kane, with meticulous calculation, arranged it to look like a hunting accident on the Newman ranch. Victor, proud and stubborn, loved to patrol his property, shotgun in hand, asserting dominance even over the wild deer that trespassed, and Kane would position himself as an unseen phantom in the woods, his rifle loaded not with warning but with finality. Nikki's role was to lure Victor there, to provoke him into one of his territorial displays, while Jack's role was to manage the aftermath, ensuring that suspicion never reached Nikki, guiding authorities to conclude that the Black Knight's arrogance had led to his own demise. And yet, on the eve of their dark endeavor, Nikki lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her lavish but hollow bedroom, whispering into the darkness, "In return for what, Victor? For all the years you took. For every piece of me you shattered." For in truth, her bargain was not with Kane or Jack but with the ghost of her own brokenness, trading Victor's life for the illusion of her own salvation. And so the question of in return for what stretched beyond corporate stakes and fractured empires. It was the price of liberation, of vengeance, of erasing decades of submission to a man who had always demanded loyalty but had never offered true love without a leash. But Genoa City is a place where secrets rot beneath every mansion and betrayal breeds betrayal. And though Kane lifted his rifle under the pale moonlight and Jack waited with calculated dread for the news, the alliance itself trembled, because even in their unity, none fully trusted the others. Jack wondered if Kane would use Victor's death to blackmail them. Kane wondered if Jack and Nikki would scapegoat him, and Nikki, torn between resolve and remorse, wondered if fate itself would intervene, if Victor, the man too stubborn to ever die on anyone's terms but his own, would somehow rise from the trap they set. In return for what? The question lingered as the trigger was pulled, as echoes rang across the ranch, as three conspirators bound by hatred and necessity discovered that the answer was not a single reward but a Pandora's box of consequences, each more devastating than the last. And though Victor's body might fall, his ghost would haunt Nikki, Jack, and Kane forever, reminding them that assassinating a king may grant you the throne, but it costs you your soul. The rifle's echo had barely faded into the midnight air when Nikki felt the sound reverberating in her bones, a reverberation that was more than auditory. It was spiritual, the tolling of a bell that marked the collapse of one life and the horrifying birth of another. She stood in the clearing with her breath caught in her throat, her pulse pounding so violently that for a moment she thought her body itself would betray her and collapse. Yet beside her Kane moved like a predator satisfied, lowering his weapon with a glint in his eyes that revealed both triumph and calculation, while somewhere back in the shadows Jack waited for the signal, half hoping, half dreading that the moment of reckoning had arrived at last. And yet, in the seconds after the shot, when the wind swept through the trees and the silence pressed like a suffocating hand, there was no sound of Victor's body collapsing to the ground, no cry, no gasp, only a lingering stillness that unsettled even Kane, whose confidence cracked into a grimace as he whispered, "Why don't I hear him?" And with that, Nikki staggered forward, her heels sinking into the dirt as she strained her eyes through the darkness until the truth emerged. Victor was not lying crumpled in death but standing, impossibly upright, his silhouette framed against the moon, his cane gripped in one hand like a weapon, his other hand clutching the front of his jacket where the bullet had struck. And when he stepped into the pale light, revealing the dented glint of a bulletproof vest beneath his suit, Nikki's world tilted. For Victor Newman had not only anticipated betrayal, he had prepared for it, as though he had foreseen Nikki's disloyalty, Kane's ruthlessness, and Jack's hatred coalescing into this night. His voice, hoarse but laced with that unmistakable authority, cut through the night air. You think you can kill Victor Newman? You think you can take me out like some pawn in your little game? You've underestimated me for the last time. And Nikki, frozen, felt every memory of her marriage flash before her. The moments of tenderness, the brutal arguments, the endless cycles of destruction and reconciliation. And she realized with soul-crushing horror that Victor had never trusted her, not fully, that he had been waiting, watching, baiting her like prey, and now the trap had been sprung. Kane, not one to falter, lifted his rifle again. But this time a dozen floodlights blazed to life across the ranch, illuminating the clearing. And suddenly figures in black tactical gear emerged from the trees. Victor's private security force, armed and trained, surrounding Nikki and Kane with mechanical precision. Jack, watching from a distance, felt the ground vanish beneath him as he understood what this meant. Victor had not only known but had orchestrated the entire confrontation, letting them believe they had the upper hand so that he could expose them, shatter them, and reclaim his throne with the brutal finality of a chess master cornering his opponents. Kane cursed under his breath, calculating whether to fight or flee, while Nikki's knees buckled as she whispered, "You knew, all along." And Victor's gaze locked on her with both fury and heartbreak, his voice dropping into a tone that chilled her blood. "I always knew, Nikki. I just wanted to see how far you'd go." And in that moment the bargain, the in return for what, became meaningless, because the price was no longer power or freedom but their very lives, dangling in the hands of a man who thrived on control and retribution. Jack, panicked but unwilling to surrender, dialed an emergency number to activate his own counterplan. He had arranged for Kyle and a Jabot loyalist to wait with a getaway car, and within minutes the scene exploded into chaos as Kane fired blindly into the floodlights. Security men dove for cover, and Jack charged into the clearing shouting Nikki's name, his face twisted with both desperation and fury. Bullets shredded branches, the night filled with the cacophony of betrayal and survival. And Nikki found herself dragged by Kane toward the tree line while Victor shouted, "You'll regret this, Nikki. You'll regret betraying me more than anyone ever has." And though she wanted to collapse, to beg, to throw herself into the arms of the man she had loved and hated for decades, she forced herself to keep moving, knowing that to hesitate was to consign herself to Victor's wrath, a fate worse than prison, worse than death. Somehow, in the chaos, the three conspirators reached the waiting car, Jack behind the wheel, Kane shoving Nikki into the back seat, and as the tires screamed against the pavement, Nikki looked out the window at Victor's silhouette, shrinking in the distance, still standing, still unbroken, and she knew that their alliance had not only failed but had unleashed a storm the likes of which Genoa City had never seen. For Victor Newman, the man impossible to kill, had been offered betrayal not just from his enemies but from the woman he had once placed on a pedestal, and that wound, deeper than any bullet, would drive him into a campaign of vengeance that would scorch the earth beneath all three of them. And so the story shifted, no longer about what they would gain in return for Victor's assassination, but about what they would lose in return for trying. And the answer, as Jack would later mutter in the safety of the Abbott mansion, bourbon glass trembling in his hand, was simple and devastating. Everything. Nikki sat beside him, her face pale, her eyes hollow, Kane pacing like a caged tiger across the rug, muttering plans about disappearing again, vanishing before Victor could retaliate. But Nikki knew there would be no escape, not this time. Because Victor was not a man who let betrayal go unanswered, and when he came, and he would come, there would be no corner of the world safe enough to shield them. In the days that followed, Newman Enterprises released a statement about an attack on Victor's life, carefully omitting Nikki's name but making it clear that Victor had survived and that those responsible would face consequences beyond comprehension. Whispers filled the Genoa City elite, speculation ran rampant. And while Kane tried to spin the situation into leverage, arguing that their failure could still fracture Victor's reputation, still weaken him in the eyes of his allies, Jack and Nikki knew better. Victor had turned the attempt into a show of strength, a demonstration that not even betrayal from within could topple him. And that knowledge sank like a stone in Nikki's chest. Alone at night, she would stare into the mirror and whisper, "In return for what, Victor? For your empire? For my freedom? For your love? Was it worth it?" And the silence that answered her was heavier than any chain. Cain, furious and restless, began plotting anew, insisting they double down, strike again, this time smarter, harder, deadlier. But Jack, shaken by how close they had come to being obliterated, pulled back, warning that another attempt would only accelerate their destruction. Nikki, torn between both, felt her sanity fray as she envisioned Victor's face, not just the rage but the hurt, the wound of knowing she had conspired against him, and she realized that perhaps the true punishment was not what Victor would do but what she had done to herself. She had assassinated not his body, but his trust, his belief, the fragile bond that had survived so much, and in that sense, she had succeeded. She had killed the part of Victor that still loved her, and in return she had gained only an empty heart and a haunted conscience. In the aftermath of that failed assassination attempt, Genoa City became a city under siege, not from an invading force but from the invisible hand of Victor Newman tightening around every corner of its power structure. And while Nikki, Jack, and Cain tried to compose themselves behind locked doors and shuttered blinds, the world outside whispered with rumors that grew louder each day. Was Nikki complicit? Was Jack finally destroyed? Had Cain overplayed his hand? And the more the speculation grew, the more Victor used it as fuel, orchestrating a silent campaign of retaliation that was far more devastating than a public strike, because Victor understood that true punishment was not delivered in one crushing blow but in 1,000 quiet cuts. Cain discovered this first when his accounts in overseas banks were suddenly frozen, his contacts overseas mysteriously vanishing or refusing his calls, leaving him stranded in Genoa City without the resources he had built as Aristotle Dumas, and though he raged and swore that he would rebuild, he knew deep down that only Victor could reach so far, so quickly, dismantling an empire Cain thought untouchable. Jack was next, as Jabot faced an anonymous leak of confidential files that painted the company as unstable and poorly managed, tanking its stock overnight. And though Jack scrambled to contain the fallout, hiring lawyers and PR specialists, he knew it was Victor's hand, guiding the chaos, cutting down his legacy piece by piece. Nikki, however, faced the most personal destruction, as Victor chose not to strip her of wealth or status but of peace, sending her flowers every morning, orchids in a crystal vase, each accompanied by a card signed only with a V, a reminder that he was watching, that he knew her guilt, that her betrayal had not gone unanswered. And though she tried to dismiss it as intimidation, she could not ignore the way her hands trembled each time she touched the petals, as though the flowers themselves carried poison, a symbol that she had destroyed something she could never repair. In the darkest hours of the night, she would lie awake replaying the moment Victor stood, unbroken, bulletproof, his eyes burning into hers with both fury and devastation, and she realized that though he had not killed her, he had condemned her to live in a prison of her own making. Cain, increasingly desperate, demanded that they strike again, insisting that Victor's vengeance would not stop until he was dead, but Jack refused, snapping that Cain's recklessness had already cost them everything and that another attempt would not succeed where the first had failed. And in those heated arguments Nikki sat silently, hollow, wondering which was worse, to risk death in another attempt, or to live under the crushing inevitability of Victor's retaliation. One evening, Jack found her sitting in the Abbott living room with a half-empty glass of vodka in her hand, her eyes glazed, and for the first time in years he saw Nikki not as Victor's wife or his own past lover but as a broken woman who had gambled everything and lost. And though he wanted to comfort her, to promise that somehow they would find a way out, he could not lie, not to her, not to himself, because he too felt the noose tightening around his neck. In the weeks that followed, Victor did not make a grand move, did not call the police.